This
questions.
conference will now be recorded.
If you have any questions at any point, please feel free to ask me, especially since you're the only student, it looks like today. People might join us during it, but please feel free to ask. Okay, so we'll be talking about the three branches of government. And if I'm going too fast, let me know. Okay, so first of all, why do we have three branches of government? The main reason is to protect against tyranny, which I'll be discussing further. What is tyranny? The United States Constitution requires a system of separation of powers to ensure checks and balances. Okay. Okay, first of all, we talked about protect against tyranny. Tyranny is a cruel and oppressive government. Another term you might have heard of is dictatorship, is just the same thing as tyranny. And our founding fathers, when they were creating the country, knew a lot about tyrants. They fought the Revolutionary War, which is also called War of Independence, to get out from under one. A tyrant who is called King George III of Great Britain, because the United States, before it became a country, was part of Great Britain. In their Declaration of Independence, the founders list George III's many crimes against America, including, and these were the actual words in the Declaration, establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And that was really what was driving them. Another word for absolute tyranny is absolute power. And that's where the king holds all the power and really can do whatever he pleases. And that's what they were really trying to get away from. So the U.S. Constitution establishes a system of separation of powers. The U.S. Constitution was created from 1787 to 1789, and that was after the War of Independence. The U.S. Constitution is a document that sets up our system of government. The goal was, again, to prevent tyranny by creating three branches of government. The whole idea was to establish a system of separation of powers and checks and balances. And we're going to be talking about this more, going into a little bit more detail. So here you see a little image of what this means exactly. Okay, so these are the three branches of the U.S. government, and you might have read about this or, seen this before. So here again, the U.S. Constitution, which sets up our system of government, created these three branches, which we'll go into in more detail. The first one is the legislative, which makes laws, and the legislative is made up of the U.S. Congress, which itself is divided into two houses, the Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. The second one is the executive, which carries out the laws, kind of like management in a business. It is made up of the president, the vice president, and the cabinet, the president's cabinet, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And the third one is the judicial, which is another name for the courts, basically. And that interprets the laws, it decides what the laws mean. That is made up of the Supreme Court and other federal courts. Okay, so what are these? Let's go talk a little bit more about these three branches: legislative, executive, judicial. Okay, so each branch has a specific job, like we said before. The legislative branch makes the laws or passes the laws. The executive branch carries out the laws, and the judicial branch decides what the laws mean. The Constitution, again, the document that's founded our country, spells out each branch's powers. Okay, so let's look at those a little bit more. Again, the separation of powers. Each branch has one key job so that no one branch can become too powerful. And this idea is called the separation of powers. Checks and balances. So each branch, those three branches, each branch has a certain amount of authority over the other branches. And this balances the power among them. And this concept is called checks and balances. So let's look at what that means in reality. Okay, so the legislative branch is made up of Congress, like we saw before, And this branch, and the Congress itself passes laws. Congress has two houses, which you've probably heard of, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And, when you vote, which, you probably remember that you vote for a senator for the whole state, and then your representative, which is just for your district. So the Senate has 100 senators, 2 from each state. So each state has the same number. But then the House of Representatives has a different number depending on the population of each state. So there are 435 representatives. It's a very big, number, and they meet in the Capitol building like we saw in that picture. There actually are also 6 non-voting members, like Washington, D.C., the representative cannot vote from there. There's also 1 from Puerto Rico, and then the U.S. actually has 4 overseas territories, such as Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So American voters, like I was just saying, vote or elect the members of each house. Oops. Okay, so the executive branch carries out the laws that are passed by the legislative branch. It's their responsibility to carry them out, whether they like them or not, but they still have to carry them out. Okay, so this branch is led by the president and the vice president. And then there are many departments to help the president run the country, like the Labor Department, Education, Defense, Housing and Urban Development. And the heads of these departments are called secretaries, are members of the president's cabinet. You might have remembered in the picture we saw, it said a U.S. cabinet is part of the executive branch. This cabinet provides the president with advice on various issues. And there are some other officials on the cabinet, but this is the main part of the cabinet, which is the head of each department. Okay, so that's the executive branch. Okay, whoops, I think we met. Did we get the judicial? Okay, well, let's talk, the judicial is coming next, but let's just talk about the term of office. Okay, so the president and vice president, their term of office, which means how long they're in office, they have a 4-year limit. So we vote for president and vice president for 4 years. The president picks the vice president. We're not voting independently for vice president. And then they can be reelected to a second 4-year term, and that's what we're going to be doing in November. We're going to be voting between Trump is voting as running for Republican president, and then it'll either be Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders for Democratic. And sometimes there's a third party, but that doesn't happen very often. Well, there are third parties, but they don't have much of a chance of winning. Okay, so in terms of a term of office, when president only can serve for 4 years and at the most 8 years. At the time the Constitution was written, this was actually a radical new idea because kings could serve as long as they wanted, basically, unless there was a revolution. So when they established this was a reaction to the absolute power held by the kings. They were very angry at how the king was treating them when they were the colonies before the U.S. was established. So they were very angry about this because they didn't like how they were being treated. They had no say in how they were being treated. So this is why they fought a war of independence. At that time, most countries in Europe had monarchies, which is just another name for kingdoms, a government led by a king, a queen occasionally too. The writers of the constitutions did not want to place too much power in one person's hand, which was the king, and they did not want the system of government. They were rebelling against that. Okay, so the third branch is the judicial branch, which is basically just another name for the courts. Okay, those are the courts. And the Supreme Court is the highest court in the country. It's the head of the entire judicial branch. We also have lower federal courts, which are the district and appeals courts, and those are throughout the country. And the Supreme Court, the highest court, determines whether a law passed by Congress follows the Constitution, what's in the Constitution. There's a lot of interpretation, there's a lot of disagreement about this, but they get to have the final say, basically. They also decide what the laws mean and how they should be applied to. So they have quite a bit of power. There's 9 people that serve on the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's see how checks and balances work. Let's first look at the executive branch. checks by the executive branch. Okay, so the executive branch can check. That means they can limit. Check basically means they can limit the power of the legislative branch by vetoing or rejecting a bill. A bill is basically a proposed law. The Congress passes laws, but they first are bills. They're proposed. They're not laws until they're passed by both houses of Congress and the president signs them. They also check the judicial branch, or they limit the courts by appointing the Supreme Court and other federal judges. So that means that the president gets to pick the people appointed to the Supreme Court and other federal judges. Okay, so that's how they limit the power, because they get a say. Okay, that's the executive branch. Do you have any questions? Okay. Okay, so how do checks and balances work with the legislative branch, which is Congress? Okay, so let's see how that works. I'm sorry if that's a little small, but I'll go over each one. Okay, so legislative branch can limit the power of the executive branch by overriding or overturning the president's veto of a bill or proposed law. Okay, so let's say Congress votes on a law, passes the law, sends it to president for his signature, but the president doesn't like the law. So the president says, I don't like this law. That means he vetoes it and he sends it back to Congress. Congress can actually overturn the president's veto, and that's called overriding the veto. And then the bill will actually become law. This does not happen very often. The president's party will usually stick with the president. It doesn't happen that often because you need 2/3 of both houses to overturn it. And it's really hard to get that many votes to go against the president, especially from the president's own party. Even if let's say we have a Republican president, even if you get all Democrats to vote against the president, it's really hard to get all Republicans to go against the president. So it does not happen very often. So it does happen occasionally, but it's pretty rare. Okay, so Congress also has the power to approve government spending. So it can actually refuse to give the government money for its favorite program. So let's say the president wants money for a favorite program in defense or education or housing or whatever it is, and Congress doesn't want to spend that much money. They think it's too much money. Or they may give the government, often what happens, they'll give the government less money. And because the government is responsible for the executive branch for coming up with a budget, and often Congress will not give them as much as the government wants. And it also has checks over the judicial branch, because the Senate has to approve the president's appointments to the courts. They have to approve the judges, only the Senate, not the House. And they can remove judges, which is called impeachment for the judges. And that doesn't happen very often, but it very occasionally over history has it happened. Okay. And okay, let's look at the judicial branch, the courts. The courts can limit the power of both Congress and the president or the executive branch, because they can decide whether a law passed by Congress is constitutional, follows the Constitution. And if they decide the law is unconstitutional, they have to stop enforcing the law. It is no longer law. And Congress can sometimes go back and change the law to make sure it's constitutional. That does happen, but sometimes the law is no longer enforced, and that's the end of that law. It does happen. Okay, so let's just review this, and let's take a look again at what we discussed. Again, 3 branches of government set up by the Constitution: legislative, Congress, Senate, House of Representatives. Executive carries out the laws, president, vice president, cabinet. Judicial, courts, federal courts, Supreme Court, other federal courts. Here we're not talking about the state and local courts. We're just talking about here the federal courts. Okay. Separation of powers, again, going to separate. The idea is to separate powers. So no, because we don't want any one branch to get too much power. And then checks and balance. Each branch can limit the power of the other branches. That's the whole idea. And then we're just going to go over some vocabulary. Tyranny is a cruel and oppressive government. Another word is dictatorship. Constitution is the founding document of the U.S. that set up our system of government. Separation of powers, I think we went among this, the division of power among the three branches, so none of them becomes too powerful. Checks and balances, that's the balance of power among the three branches, with each power limiting the power, of the other branches. Okay, branches of government, legislative, executive, judicial. Monarchy is a kingdom. Supreme Court, the highest court in the nation. A bill is a law proposed by Congress. It doesn't become a law until it's passed by Congress, signed by the president. A veto is when the president rejects a bill passed by Congress. Override is when Congress votes to overturn a presidential veto. And judicial review, that means when the Supreme Court decides whether a law is constitutional. And I think that's it. So please let me know if you have any questions. Anything. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me today. And, feel free, I guess this is being recorded so you can watch it again if you need to review it. Thanks.